Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video, we're going to look at topic 2.4, the price elasticity of supply. That would be textbook pages 456 to 459. But before we get into that, I did want to say one final thing about the price elasticity of demand. One thing I neglected to say in the last video is that when you're doing the formula for the price elasticity of demand, make sure you do absolute value. The reason here is because due to the law of demand, you're always going to get a negative number here because quantity demanded and price have an inverse relationship. And so if you don't do absolute value, you're always going to get a negative number instead of the positive number that you need. So just keep that in mind with that formula. With that in mind, we're basically just going to continue looking at different measures of elasticity and how to work with them. So let's look at just defining the price elasticity of supply. So the law of supply states that when the price increases, quantity supplied also increases, right? So there's this positive relationship between price and quantity. And so how much quantity supplied changes depends on the seller or group of sellers. How sensitive are they to a price change? How will they respond? And so the price elasticity of supply, therefore, is how much quantity supplied changes in response to the change in price. Are sellers going to respond with a big gesture and sell a lot more or a lot less? Or are they going to barely respond and just sell a little more or a little less? That's the idea of the price elasticity of supply. So, in terms of the definitions, elastic supply is the quantity is when quantity supplied is greatly affected by a change in price. In other words, the seller is going to respond significantly when there's a price change and increase what they supply by quite a bit or decrease what they supply by quite a bit. Inelastic supply is the idea that quantity supplied is barely affected by a change in price. In other words, the seller is really going to keep selling what they've been selling before in roughly the same quantities. So, in terms of determining whether a good has elastic or inelastic supply, one way to do that is by looking at certain characteristics surrounding the production of the good or service. The first one is the availability of inputs. The more readily available inputs are, the more elastic the supply because you can easily switch those resources from producing one good or service to another good or service. So cookies are once again a great example, as we did with the PPC, where I can easily switch from making chocolate chip cookies to sugar cookies, right? So that would make the supply pretty elastic if I got a better price for one cookie over the other. Whereas if I'm producing rockets and suddenly someone comes in and says, hey, you're going to go make water bottles now, the supply is probably pretty inelastic for rockets because it's not easy to take the parts needed for rockets and suddenly go make something as small as water bottles, right? Like those are two very different goods or services. Second, how much time has passed? This is very similar to what we did with the price elasticity of demand. The more time you give someone to change their behavior, the more elastic the demand, or in this case, the supply. And then finally, the barriers to entry. How easy is it, excuse me, how easy is it for new firms to enter the market? The easier it is, the more elastic supply because you're giving sellers more choice. And that's going to really influence how much they sell. Whereas if there's high barriers to entry, the supply is going to be pretty inelastic. So here's my question: which would have more elastic supply, pizza or cell phone frequency? So go ahead, pause the video, take a look at this, and then we'll go over the answer. So the correct answer here would be pizza, and the reason is because the ingredients used to make pizza can easily be switched from producing one good or service to another good or service. Cell phone frequencies, high barriers to entry. harder to get in, more inelastic. So if we want a mathematical way to calculate the price elasticity of supply, we have a formula here. This would be the percent change in the quantity supplied divided by the percent change in the price. Now you will notice here, I began the video by talking about the price elasticity of demand formula and saying, hey, you need absolute value. Here, you do not need absolute value. The reason being, this number is always going to be positive. Like the answer here, it's always going to be positive. Why? Because there's a direct relationship between quantity supplied and price. They either both go up or both go down. So this answer is always going to be positive. You can do absolute value if it helps you, but you're still going to get to the same answer. In terms of interpreting the price elasticity of supply coefficient, it works exactly the same as with demand. If the number is between 0 and 1, that's inelastic supply. If the number is equal to 1, that is going to be unit elastic supply. And if it's greater than 1, it's going to be elastic supply. Finally, I wanted to look at modeling the price elasticity of supply with two specific examples. Once again, a perfectly inelastic supply curve and a perfectly elastic supply curve. And you'll see that they work exactly the same way as with demand. Perfectly inelastic is vertical, a price elasticity of supply coefficient of 0. And then you have a horizontal supply curve for perfectly elastic. So just something to keep in mind. It's important to keep those straight, which one's vertical, which one's horizontal, in terms of modeling. Because you will encounter examples later on where the supply and or the demand curves are perfectly inelastic or elastic. And knowing how to draw them is going to be important. So that's all for this video on price elasticity of supply. Until next time, have a great day.